Hello, I'm Devashish Banerjee, and I'm going to talk to you about another figure from this book by Carl Jaspers, Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, Jesus. And today I'm going to talk to you about Buddha. And Buddha is the one Indian figure of these four figures that Jaspers writes about. And Buddha also belongs to what he calls the axial age. And it's interesting that he includes Buddha in this treatment because in some ways Buddha is very different from a Western thinker. And Jaspers recognizes that in his treatment of the Buddha. So this book was written in the 1950s, and at that time the knowledge about the Buddha, the environment in which he lived, all the texts connected with him was perhaps not that available. And so it is remarkable to see how in a short scope of a chapter he has provided such a penetrating view, analysis and description of the Buddha and his life and discussed the essence of his teaching. Jaspers' chapter on the Buddha is divided into 6 sections. The first section deals with his life. The second section deals with his doctrine and meditation as the center of his doctrine. The third deals with the expressed doctrine. What is the expression of his doctrine? The fourth asks the question whether there is anything new with the Buddha's teaching at the time that it's taught. The fifth talks about the extension of Buddha's teachings. And the sixth discusses or raises the question about what it means to us today. So, in terms of the life of the Buddha, Carl Jaspers is an existential philosopher, and he is really interested in if we can understand something about the life of the Buddha from the viewpoint of emulation. To what extent can we follow in his footsteps? So he wants to cut out all the accretions of legend in the various texts about the Buddha and give us his life as a human being. And so Jaspers looks at the early texts connected with the Buddha's life and gives us the view of a person who was a prince and who was moved by the problem of suffering which he encountered in his everyday life, and this made him leave society, following the footsteps of others in the society who also sought out the way of the wanderer to explore deep philosophical questions. And he followed the way of these people into the forest, and in Jaspers' understanding, in Jaspers' terms, he went around with some what he calls Hindus. Today we know that these were not Hindus. Firstly, the term Hindu is an aberration to use at the time of the Buddha, but secondly, even if we understand by it the culture that has arisen out of the Veda, the persons that the Buddha moved around with cannot be called Hindu. Nevertheless, he moved around with a few ascetics, forest ascetics, and then at a certain point left them because he found their practices not to be conducive to getting the answer to the question that he sought. He taught the middle way, which is not too much abstention and not too much indulgence of the path of life and its activities, its needs. So the Buddha went into the forest alone after leaving the company of these wandering ascetics, and he sat under what Jaspers calls a fig tree. It is in class only, in species of fig tree, in Latin called the Ficus religiosa, and more commonly known today as the Bodhi tree, in India called the peepal or the Ashwatha tree. And sitting under this tree, he went into meditation, and in Jaspers' terms, he had a flash which showed him the meaning of life and the various factors that kept us experiencing the nature of our experience. And out of this, he derived, or he came to an understanding of how he could get out of this phenomenal existence of suffering. Then Jaspers talks about the aftermath of that experience, where he says the Buddha sat waiting in that condition for quite a long time, for days, and then decided after an inner struggle, which also is Jaspers' understanding, because the texts don't really talk about an inner struggle, but he did wonder about whether he ought to continue in some form, or he had come to the end of his understanding and the mission of his life. Well, he was directed to teach the path that he has, the insight that he had understood. And Jaspers classes Buddha as a wisdom teacher because he points out that the main teaching of the Buddha is that insight solves our problems, that it is wisdom that brings the solution to our problems. So the Buddha went to the city of Varanasi, and in its outskirts he taught his first sermons. And in fact, these 5 people with wandering ascetics with whom he was traveling in the forest became his first disciples over there. The lesson that Buddha taught brought a certain kind of new teaching into existence. The Buddha's teaching was one of analysis of our everyday existence, the grounds of our experience, and how we can meditate to get ourselves out of that condition. He gathered around him a following with this teaching, and again Jaspers points out that he rejected the Hindu teachings or the teachings of the Veda and created something new. This also we need to question, because though it is true that he rejected certain key elements of the Veda, particularly its animal sacrifices and its emphasis on gods, there can be a questionable view as to whether the Buddha rejected the Veda or whether he created a kind of path that was in its own way a Vedic path. Nevertheless, he gathered a following, and he was given a lot of importance in northern India. And during the monsoon months, 3 months of the rainy season in India, wandering ascetics are supposed to stay in one place. And the Buddha and his followers, Jaspers points out that though the Buddha taught in the language of the people, the vernacular language, and not in Sanskrit, as a matter of fact, the early disciples that he gathered were not so much the people, but the elite. And so these people got a good hearing from the rulers of kingdoms in which they moved about, and important and wealthy people often gave them room to stay during those 3 months. And it is during that period that he taught his great sermons. And at the age of 80, the Buddha had an intimation of his passing, and he, at a certain point, the texts tell us that he consumed some food that was given to him. He followed what was common in India at that time for wandering ascetics, which is the beggar's path, spiritual poverty. So he would take whatever was given to him, and what was given to him apparently was either rotten pork or a mushroom which was lethal. And in any case, he ate this, and then he called his disciples together and said it was time for him to pass. And his last words were, "Strive ceaselessly." And so Jaspers, in reflecting on this in terms of meditation and the doctrine, points out very clearly some very key factors with regard to the Buddha's life as an axial age wisdom teacher. And the main thing that he's pointing out, in contrast to the Western tradition of thinking, philosophizing using thought, is though the Buddha taught with thought, he was really pointing to a point, an experience beyond thought. He also points out, because he himself is an existentialist, the importance of the will in the Buddha's teaching. He points out that in the nature of this kind of philosophy, it is the will that dominates, so that when we call it a philosophy, we have to use the term practical or pragmatic philosophy. He doesn't use this term himself. I am reading those terms into what he's saying. But essentially, the nature of the kind of philosophy to which Buddha belongs, and which today we can call yoga philosophy, is a pragmatic philosophy or pragmatic form of philosophy. And what that means is that one starts with a problem and one attempts to find a solution to that problem. In the solution that one finds also a path. That path relates one to the world in terms of certain categories and a kind of practical metaphysics by which one can arrive at that path. So this is how the world view or philosophy of the Buddha needs to be understood. He also points out the fact of the preparation needed to get to this point, given the fact that what we have as our equipment as human beings is a heterogeneous consciousness. We cannot address all the various aspects of our consciousness with one kind of preparation or teaching. But there's a variety of things we need to do to address these various layers of consciousness in ourselves. And so we are talking about a lifestyle teaching, a teaching of various aspects of living to prepare ourselves to be ready for the kind of insight that is needed to become the solution to the problem one has set oneself. So these are the ways in which Jaspers understands meditation and the doctrine, and he brings that out quite clearly because it's in a sense alien to the Western tradition of thinking. And so he goes into quite a lot of penetrating depth about layers of consciousness and about thought and how one can reach beyond thought in meditation. The chapter on doctrine as expressed is where he talks about the major teachings of the Buddha. And these are essentially the first sermon, where he talks about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The second sermon, where he talks about the doctrine of no self. And the sermon connected cause and effect, the 12 connected causes and effects. He also talks about what are called the skandhas, the various layers of difference in kind of consciousness that we carry with ourselves and how they are addressed. Next, in the section on what is new in Buddhism, he starts very interestingly by pointing out that there is actually nothing really new in Buddhism. I'd like to read that passage. He says, for example, there was nothing particularly new in Buddha's doctrines, terminology, forms of thought, conceptions, or actions. Ascetics, ascetic communities, and practice of monastic life already existed. The forest hermits came of all castes and were looked upon as saints regardless of their origin. The idea of redemption by knowledge was there before him, as was yoga, the path of the stages of meditation. And Buddha unquestioningly took over old conceptions of the cosmos, the ages of the world, and the world of the gods. The whole Buddhist doctrine may appear to be the perfection of a Hindu form of life grounded in transcendence, a culmination of Hindu philosophy. So, Jaspers' idea on what is new in the Buddha's teaching sees it actually as a culmination of Hindu teaching. This is also very questionable because the word Hindu again is being used in a kind of a stereotypical way and in a way which is not very appropriate, particularly to its time. Also, what one has to realize is not that there were no teachers like Buddha before him, but that there were no biographies produced as a hagiographical device for establishing a religion before him. What is really new about the Buddha is that in his succeeding generations, he is made into a figure that exemplifies his teaching. That device of creating the biography of the teacher is a religious device, a device for creating a religion that had not been used before, because the need for creating a religion was not felt. The second new thing about the Buddha that Jaspers does not talk about is that the way in which he spoke, or the way in which he's represented to have been spoken, is as a form of enumeration, a form of various propositions that need to be followed one after the other, like the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path and the 12, successions of cause and effect, etc. This is a pedagogical method, which is quite different from the methods that had gone before, which were more oral methods, methods of oral transmission and intimate speech. So those are forms in which we can see that Buddhism couches itself as a world religion, and Jaspers sees that fact, that it creates a new kind of humanity. In a way, it creates a world humanity, a world religion. Jaspers ends by talking about what is the relevance of this today. And it's interesting to see, he was writing in the 50s when the Buddhism was not so popular, and he tries to say that it's very alien from the West, it will never really hold our attention, but we have to try to understand it, etc. I think he would have been surprised today to see the expansion and proliferation of Buddhism in the West. And so I think we need to value what he has to say, but look deeper at our own times.